Well, good morning. Thank you all for joining this session entitled How to Be an Inclusive Workplace. My name is Joyce Fields, and I am the Manager of Career Decision Making for the LSU Olin Career Center. Please make sure that your microphones are on mute and your video is hidden for the duration of today's workshop. Should you have questions during this session, please use the chat feature to send a message. Make sure you send it to everyone so that the group will benefit from your questions as well. And we will do our best to answer your questions during this session. If your question does not get answered, please reach out and contact us at the end of the event. For the best session experience, please select Speaker View in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And please note that this session is being recorded. Now, it is my honor to introduce our speakers, both from the LSU Office of Multicultural Affairs, Michelle Carter as Director and Wes Heath, Assistant Director. And thank you, Michelle and Wes, for joining us today.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to participate in this particular workshop. My name is Michelle Carter. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. As Joyce said, I am the Director of the Office of Multicultural Affairs. I've been at LSU a little bit over 2 years. I'll let Wes go ahead and introduce himself before we get started.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Wes Heath, and I am the Assistant Director for Cross-Cultural Affairs. I use he, him, his pronouns. If you don't know what pronouns are, that's okay. We'll talk about it as part of today's presentation. And I have been at LSU for just under 4 years now, and we're very excited to have this conversation with you today. So if you have any questions, let us know. We'll try and keep an eye on the chat room as well if anything comes up in there.
Yes. So we're going to talk about how to be an inclusive workplace. I'm going to start off by talking about cultural identity and inclusion from a general standpoint. Then Wes is going to get into some more specific topics later on. But first, for cultural identity, we have to recognize that all people have cultural identity, both visible and invisible. Identity is comprised of many aspects, and each aspect should be respected. We should be aware of our own cultural complexity of our cultural identities, and the aim should be to create a workplace environment where all identities are welcome. So when I talk about both visible and invisible identities, some visible identities for me is I'm an African-American woman, I wear my hair natural, but some invisible things that you may not know about me are that, unless I tell you, of course, is that I'm a mother and I also grew up in foster care. So those are some identities that you won't just know just by looking at me. So what are some characteristics of an inclusive workplace? Employees feel welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. That's key, and it's very important. Here at LSU, we recently went through a very intensive process where we created a diversity roadmap. And some of the things that we looked at are, do staff, both faculty and staff, feel welcome, valued, respected, and heard? We issued a survey to try to gather some data, but we also heard from people individually. Is there equal opportunity for advancement? And I have equal in quotes because equal isn't an ideal. It's kind of hard to achieve, but I think it's something that we can work towards. Is there a system for reporting bias and discrimination, including consequences for substantiated claims? So is there a system of accountability for both employees and supervisors? Diversity is celebrated. So it's one thing to say, you know, we have a diverse group of people in our organization, but do all identities feel welcome and celebrated? Diversity training. We all can learn how to be better allies, how to be better co-workers. So we hope that there's training in place to help people do that. An inclusive physical environment. and this is just examples of ways that you can do an inventory of whether or not you have an inclusive physical environment. Wheelchair or motorized chair accessible? Is Braille included on signs? Gender welcoming restrooms. Some people may have gender neutral restrooms, but all restrooms, regardless of whether or not we have gender exclusive restrooms, whether or not we have gender neutral restrooms, all restrooms should be welcoming. Lactation spaces. So if we have mothers who are lactating, do they have spaces where they can be in private that are safe and allow them to lactate? Seating to accommodate various body sizes and heights. That's probably one that a lot of people don't think about. So sometimes I know for me personally, it's not just seating, but whether or not they're seating at all. Sometimes in Louisiana, we have receptions where we'll have the tall tables. And for some people, standing up can be a bit of a hindrance for a long period of time. I know for me it is. So do we have seating to accommodate various body sizes and weights? And is there seating at all? Proactive questions that ask about accessibility prior to any meeting. I know when we send out registration forms, we try to make sure that we cover a question that addresses that so we can try to accommodate people. Prospective employee expectations. So what I think about here is, what are students looking for? What are we encouraging our students to look for? Is there an organizational diversity statement? Is there diversity within the executive leadership? So it's one thing to be recruited to work for an organization, but if I go to that organization's website and all I see are people who don't look like me, that could be a concern. Inclusive language and communications. So using gender neutral pronouns in any communication that goes out. Images on the website that showcase diversity. Are there affinity groups? We were very fortunate to work with one of the petrochemical organizations for a program last year. And we were so excited because they had so many affinity groups that we could tap into. And so I know our students get excited about that kind of thing too. And again, accessibility. Do you ask about accessibility and accommodations? Do an inventory of your policies and practices. Go from recruiting to hiring, performance evaluations to promotion. Are you allowing people to succeed? Are you creating opportunities for them to succeed and giving them the support? Do you value diversity when you're doing a performance evaluation? Things like that. So just go through an inventory of your policies and practices. Now, there are numerous anti-discrimination laws, and it's not my intent to go through them. But what I do want to say is this is the baseline. You don't want to be looking for what you need to avoid doing wrong. You want to be proactive and not do the bare minimum to ensure that you have an inclusive environment. So even though they have these anti-discrimination laws, and Wes is going to mention one later on, we don't want you to get caught up on that, because it's about making the place a welcoming space. So not just, taps on the hand when you do something wrong, but, encouraging people to do the right thing. Recognizing the pervasiveness of biases. As I was doing my research, I saw encouragement to use blind hiring methods. To evaluate applicants for their skills and potential, free from biases about their gender, race, etc. Well, is it possible to be free from biases? And how do you do that? One thing I would argue for is more to use a holistic approach when you're looking at applicants, because even if you remove the name of the person, some people may harbor a bias about the university where the applicant received a degree. We all have these hidden biases, these shortcuts that our minds take, and we call that implicit bias. It's so pervasive, we don't even realize that we have these implicit biases sometimes. So we want to try to acknowledge that we have them so that we can then overcome them. One thing I wanted to mention is that we have a program that many of you all may be interested in. It's called Diversity at Work. It is a partnership between our office, the Olin Career Center, and the Minority Women's Movement. And we're collaborating to host the 3rd annual Diversity at Work Career Symposium in March. But even before March, we're going to have monthly symposiums, monthly panels, if you will, where we have members of various cultural identities sit on a panel and talk to the students. So if you're interested in student engagement, this will be a great opportunity. The very first one we're going to have is during Latinx Heritage Month, which runs from September 15th to October 15th. And so if you're interested, you can contact our office at oma@lsu.edu or career@lsu.edu. And the last thing I want to say before Wes moves on is that inclusion starts with you. We all have a responsibility to create an environment where everyone feels like they not only have a seat at the table, but that they're truly welcome. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this share so that Wes can start his part of the presentation.
All right, thank you, Michelle. All right, so can you see my PowerPoint screen here, Michelle? Perfect, okay. All right, so moving on specifically into some dialogue about different diversity affinity groups that you might be seeing from students that are graduating LSU. I want to start off by giving you a snapshot of what diversity looks like with Gen Z population. And I read earlier in the program that they offered a look into Gen Z identities earlier this morning. So hopefully you all had a chance to look at those, and some of this information might be comparable. But I really want to focus on diversity around Gen Z identities. So just a snapshot here. First, we're looking at Gen Z being the most diverse generation ever. And that should be very insightful for you as employers that are looking to hire LSU graduates. Just some percentages here. We're looking at about 25% Hispanic or Latinx identities, 14% Black or African American identity, and then 6% Asian American identities. And that's just projections right now. Of course, we don't know the exact numbers. We'll know a little more after the 2020 census data comes in. Next part, most likely, the Gen Z is most likely to identify as non-binary or agender. So if you don't know what those identities mean, we'll talk about them a little bit later. But essentially what we're looking at is identities that fall under the trans umbrella, the transgender umbrella here. And we've seen a growth in population. We'll see later that we have about 1 million current employers that identify as trans, and that doesn't include any Gen Z individuals yet. So that'll be interesting, and we'll have some some different things that might be impactful for you as an employer when working with trans students later on in the presentation. The next is that Gen Z are going to be the most formally educated generation in history. So you're looking at in education differences, you're looking at most students with college degrees, master's degrees, and even PhDs. And then the second part, or last part here, experiencing social activism during youth. We're looking at a generation that has grown up around social activism, and it finds social activism to be a very important part of the workplace. Some key social activism identities include income inequality, Black Lives Matter, and LGBTQ rights movement. Some additional information here, changing values and beliefs in terms of what we've experienced with generations before versus what you might expect from students that identify or students that are within the Gen Z age range. First of all, you'll see a belief that race and ethnicity cannot be described quantitatively. So that means on surveys, we are very used to identifying our race and ethnicity via boxes on surveys where you have a one-stop shop, a one check mark identity. And Gen Z don't value that as much. They see that their race and ethnicity is something that is something that we consider sui generis, something that is unique in and of itself and cannot be described by a check mark on a survey. So one thing that I have started doing in my work in terms of anything that I'm sending out sort of assessment or surveys is just leaving an open fill in the blank box for race or ethnicity and letting the students to describe where they feel like that describes them most. So as you're doing applications, or if you're in charge of surveys or assessments or evaluations, there might be something to consider. is that students don't necessarily, or today's students, incoming employees, don't necessarily see value in that. The second part is experiencing technology in a way that inspires global diversity. Our students are more globally engaged than any generation previously, and technology has made that very possible. So when you look at students in terms of their understanding of international diversity, you're coming into a generation that believes that the world is very small, and in fact, diversity has allowed that to be the case. Third part here, we have a generation that believes that systemic solutions, that there are systemic solutions to systemic discrimination. It's not enough to simply say that your organization or company is diverse. They want to see what systemic solutions, what concrete actions organizations and companies are taking to ensure that they have a better experience, to ensure that they're welcoming individuals from different backgrounds, that they're celebrating diversity, and not just putting out statements that they accept everyone regardless of. They're looking to go a step beyond that and say, it's not regardless of my identity, it's inspired by my identity. And then fourth on here, they want to be engaged with their work. They want to work for companies that they like. And you like companies that value you as a person. So that should be really inspiring for many organizations and companies out there. What can we do to make our employees like us? What can we do to have our employees have a good time, a welcoming environment at work where they see our values? And that moves right into the next one. Employees from Gen Z want to see value in a company beyond products and services. They want to know that the company stands up for something, or the company has ethics and follows ethical guidelines in terms of how they treat employees, how they treat their customers. And that is a big value for Gen Z employees. And then lastly, they believe in social activism within the workplace. You're looking at 77% say that they want their employees, they want to be employees in a workplace that values social activism. And that can mean a lot of different things, and we'll have more on that later on in the presentation. So here are some of the anticipated challenges that companies should be looking at now, if they're not looking at already, when they're talking about hiring Gen Z workers. The first one is the gender gap within tech fields. This 34% here is the amount of women that were already in tech industry, women that are studying in education right now in tech related fields that believe that women belong in tech field. That's only 34%. That's a crazy low number. We need to be working on changing that understanding that tech field's open to anyone regardless of gender. And then the second part here, lack of diversity and inclusion efforts among STEM companies. This is a huge thing that needs to be worked on, and Gen Z are taking notice of this. There needs to be intentional diversity and inclusion efforts within all companies, but more specifically, the work needs to start ramping up within STEM companies. The next one, wage gap across all industries. Wage gap is still very real. And when there was a poll among Gen Z future employees, financial security was one of the top values that they saw in a job. So when you look at wage gap across all industries and the emphasis on social activism that Gen Z students have, you can imagine this wage gap is going to be a huge complication for those students. They're going to be looking at industries that have worked towards dismantling this gap. The next one is the rising cost of living and the lowering entry-level pay. We see this as a trend across all industries, but more specifically, we see this as a trend for incoming or entry-level positions that Gen Z might be taking in. So we need to make sure that our salaries, that our entry-level positions are paying the actual amount, and that people are actually able to afford the cost of living in the places where these jobs are located. And then the last part is unpaid internships. And I've had this conversation with a few people over the past couple of years where unpaid internships were a thing of the past. They used to be ways of getting great experience before entering the work field. But think about the students that can afford to go through or accept unpaid internships. These are students that are already financially capable or have financially capable parents that are paying their way. They already have enough money to afford living and housing and car payments, but they're doing unpaid internships in order to gain that experience to help them with their resumes. Well, think about the students that are coming from lower income backgrounds and their inability to accept unpaid internships, and how that creates an experience gap for incoming students. So if you're really wanting to diversify the students that you're getting in these positions, you need to be looking at these systemic barriers that offer experiences to those students that can already afford them. but instead offering paid internships to gain experience from students that wouldn't otherwise be able to accept a position like that. So as Michelle alluded to in her portion of the presentation, LGBTQ plus population is a growing population. And one of my specialty areas is working with companies in terms of creating LGBTQ inclusive policies and procedures. And I wanted to give you a little snapshot today of some information that might be pertaining to you as employers. Let's see, the first one here, today's LGBTQ plus employee, I have this statement here that might help, that might be beneficial. LGBTQ plus employees are more likely to be out in terms of out of the closet in the workplace than ever before in our nation's history. However, protections for LGBTQ plus employees have only marginally increased within state governments over the last several decades. And I have a next slide on that coming up. And then I have this little statistic here. 1 out of every 10 employees would be considered within the LGBTQ plus community. That's because 10% of the population is considered LGBTQ. And then down here, the current working population is around 1 million trans workers and around 7.1 million lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, omnisexual, etc. Workers nationwide. So you're looking at about 8 million people worldwide, or nationwide, I'm sorry, that identify within the LGBTQ plus community. So you're talking about a substantial population and one that is ever growing. So prior to June 15th, and if you've been following national news, you might know what June 15th is referring to. But prior to June 15, 2020, only 29 states included protections for sexual orientation, and only 32 states included protections for gender identity. And you can kind of see the map of how that, how those states were diversified across the United States here. However, on June 15th, we had federal protections that were offered for LGBTQ plus employees, again, at the national level through the Supreme Court. So I wanted to give you an update on where that was. I know it was big news and we probably have all heard about it, but we haven't really heard a lot about it since June 15th. So you might be wondering where that is. Well, we are actually right here in terms of the Supreme Court ruling. This has been done. However, what actually needs to happen next is that the Department of Justice needs to write up how this is going to be enforced. It needs to move into the Department of Labor and the EEOC for guidances on how states need to be working with this. And then it goes into state enforcement. When the Supreme Court has ruled on federal protections in the past, all 4 of these things have been accomplished within a matter of weeks. However, now we're looking at a couple of months since this ruling, and none of these other 3 things have been done yet. So in terms of actual protection, yes, the Supreme Court agrees it needs to be there, and we do have laws that pertain to it now. But in terms of guidance and enforcement, we have nothing so far. So your employees, LGBTQ+ employees, might be a little bit concerned about this, and future employees, if these things aren't actually taken care of. So that's one thing I wanted to be very apparent with, is that protections might exist, but enforcement might not be. All right, so today's LGBTQ+ employee, I wanted you to look at this corporate equality index. This is something that you can Google and look up different companies and what their profiles are. And the corporate equality index gauges company interest based on these 4 areas in terms of LGBTQ+ inclusion. The first one here is non-discrimination policies. Do your non-discrimination policies include sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression? All 3. If they do, A+. The second one is LGBTQ+ supportive employee benefits. This can be quite broad, but looking specifically at employee benefits that focus on LGBTQ+ equity. This might be paid parental leave for same-sex parents. Even if those same-sex parents are both male and either are pregnant, you can still do supportive employee benefits for leave for parents that are adopting children. That could be one, or in mental and physical health. Many companies are starting to include PrEP as part of their coverages for HIV prevention. So there's a lot of things that can fall under this supportive employee benefits package here. And there's a whole list you can look at online for more information on that. Excuse me. And then the third one here, supportive corporate culture. So what are you doing internally within your company that's offering a supportive culture and that's celebrating queer identities, versus this last one here, which is responsible citizenship. This can be quite broad, but I did include this subsection here, local laws. So responsible citizenship could be holding politicians and public officials accountable for policies that are going to make your area more exciting for LGBTQ plus individuals to live in or relocate to. I'd say Louisiana is one of the worst states in the United States in terms of LGBT plus inclusion in state law. So what are you doing as a corporation that is wanting to make state law more accepting and more accommodating to diversity? Because employees are really taking a look at this when they say, do I really want to live in Louisiana? Do I really want to relocate to Louisiana? What do the laws look like? And how does the company I'm working for stand up against laws that might not protect me? So all four of those things, corporate equality index, and give it a Google and see if your company is listed within the corporate equality index. And if it's not, that is something you can advocate for and get put on this corporate equality index, because I guarantee you that queer employees are looking you up if they're going to be interviewing with you. So moving beyond just corporate identities and corporate ways that corporations can help queer identities, and looking into more personal allyship and things that we can all be doing to work with LGBTQ plus employees, and things that we can do in our language that is more accepting. The first one is this term lifestyle. We hear this all the time when people say that's a lesbian lifestyle, that's a gay lifestyle. Lifestyle isn't really a thing. Everyone lives their own identities differently. Just like there's no one white lifestyle or one black lifestyle, the same is the case here for LGBTQ identities. So we want to avoid that language. Really what we do when we say lifestyle, what comes up for us are these understandings of stereotypes. When you think of lifestyle, you have images that pop into your mind, and we want to avoid that as all possible. And I will tell you that if you're ever interviewing a candidate, or if ever talking with an employee and lifestyle comes up in your language surrounding identity, they're automatically going to assume that you don't know a little bit of what you're talking about. So I would just avoid that language altogether. The second one is the belief that LGBTQ people can be changed or cured. There's a lot to say about this one. I'm just going to say that language around changing or curing identities is absolutely incorrect, and it can't be done. There's some studies that came out 2 or 3 decades ago that said it can be. They have all been identified as false moving past that. So interesting data here. We could do a whole hour-long presentation about this, but we can't know on time today. The next one is all transgender people are gay or lesbian. Understanding that these identities are on separate spectrums altogether. So you have sexual orientation, which is your attraction on the separate spectrum, then gender identity. And gender identity is what we're largely referring to when we talk about trans identities. So just because your gender identity doesn't necessarily match the sex that you were assigned at birth, doesn't necessarily mean you have an attraction to or to specifically men or women. It's completely independent of one another. Biological sex is real sex or real gender. Not necessarily true. There's a lot of misunderstanding of what biological sex means. We don't actually use the term biological sex to describe someone's sex in terms of today anymore. We use the term gender identity, and people are able to identify as man, woman, transgender, non-binary, agender, etc. Biological sex refers specifically to genitalia and chromosomes. And those things actually are not as concrete as we assume them to be. We used to think biological sex was something that stayed with a person for their entire lifespan, and that's not accurate. Biological sex is just as malleable as many other elective surgeries that you can take. So biological sex can change over time. It's not concrete. So the term that we actually use now is sex assigned at birth. So that is a snapshot in time when a doctor was able to say, this is the exact sex that you were born as. But what we need to be very careful of is understanding that sex assigned at birth does not equal gender identity. Completely different things. And if you want more information about that, there's lots of resources online. I'll have my email address at the end. If you want some of those resources, you can reach out to me. And then I have more information about safe space training as well. And then the last part here, you've all heard 3 different terms used quite interchangeably over time. But I wanted to say that transgender is actually the only word out of this entire sentence that is actually okay to use nowadays. Transgender refers to the umbrella of trans identities. Transsexual used to be a term that we'd use to differentiate between someone who elected to go through gender reassignment surgery and someone who did not. While there are individuals that still identify as transsexual, that population is not necessarily very large anymore. Most people are using the terms transgender. And as someone who is not part of the queer identity, transsexual is something that you would not want to include unless they use that identity to describe themselves, and then it would be okay. But when you're talking about the trans community as a whole, you want to use this terminology: transgender identity, transgender community, or trans individual. Hermaphrodite's been long gone, so if you're still using that in your vocabulary, we need to get that out of the system right now. Hermaphrodite's like a couple of centuries old, but we still see it popping up every now and then. Pronouns here. So we've heard a lot about pronouns. Michelle and I both introduced ourselves with our pronouns earlier. I recommend that you make pronoun usage a part of your daily corporate culture. Whenever you're doing meetings, whenever you have Zoom meetings, you can actually include your pronouns after your last name, kind of like what Michelle and I have here. It's a great way to put your pronouns out there to avoid misgendering, but it also does another important thing. Even if you are someone that has not necessarily been misgendered or has a history of being misgendered in terms of like someone referring to you as the wrong gender than you identify, putting your pronouns on corporate staff lists, on Zoom meetings, on your business cards, on your email addresses, even if it doesn't help someone better gender identify you, it lets other people know that you know what you're talking about in terms of gender identity and pronoun usage. So it's a great way for me, and I don't get misgendered all the time, very, very seldom actually. But it allows the students that I work with to know that I know what pronouns are, I know how to use them, and it makes them feel more comfortable when they're talking with me about gender identity. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Like sometimes we do things to talk about diversity that don't necessarily impact us, but they impact the people around us and how they understand their comfort level with us. So just wanting to put that out there for you. I could go into more information about pronouns, but just know this is a long list of some. The most commonly used gender neutral pronoun is the singular usage of the they pronoun. So one person identifying as they. And the second most common gender neutral pronoun would probably be per or z, kind of tied. You see those all the time. You don't have to be a mastermind on pronouns. You don't have to know all of them. There are certainly some that exist outside of this list, but just to give you a quick snapshot of them. And allyship, moving on to the last section here. Personal allyship, I broke this down into two categories: personal allyship and corporate allyship. Personal allyship are things that we can do every day in our normal lives that make us better allies. The first one is getting educated, attending workshops like this, finding things that you're not necessarily well versed in and going back and doing a little more homework, looking for resources, reading books, watching movies, etc. There's a great way. Keep getting educated. And this is something that needs to be done continually because the diverse world is consistently changing. Queer identities change week to week, different nouns, different pronouns, different verbiage. It's always changing. So make sure that you're continually getting educated. Know what resources exist so that you don't have to go in and look up resources all the time whenever somebody comes to you. Having them already detailed, having a quick list you can jump to, that would be a great thing. Know the resources. Refer when needed. There are going to be lots of times when employees or when students come to you with instances, with complications that are happening in their life and you don't know the answer. Don't make it up. Don't try and take too much time to get back to them, but refer them to somebody else who might know a little bit more about their situation than you do. And it's okay. It's not an area of weakness to refer somebody. The second to last one, never assume somebody's story. I can go into more detail about that one, but it should be without saying, don't make assumptions about people. We don't know their background. We don't know where they're coming from. So don't make assumptions, but truly get to know somebody. And then be a visible ally. So Michelle and I talk about this all the time, about having things that in your office or in your workplace that shows that you're a supportive ally, that creates an environment of inclusion. So I have here like this example of a pride pillow that you can have on a couch in your office, a Black Lives Matter sticker or decal or button that could be somewhere in your office. Representation matters. And when people come into your office, they want to see where your values are and that you're someone that's safe to talk to. Corporate allyship, some of these things we've already mentioned, but just to really wrap them up for you nice and neat. Embrace diversity and avoid tokenism. If this is the first time you're seeing the word tokenism, do a quick Google search after our meeting today, learn what tokenism is and how to avoid it. Second, diverse workforce. It means diverse talent at all levels. It can't just be diversity at one level and then everybody else above them is white and cis and straight. It's got to be diversity at all levels. Develop systems of support, whether that's mentor programs or resource groups or affinity groups. At LSU, we have 3 different organizations specifically about this. We have the Black Faculty Staff Caucus, the Latinx Faculty Staff Caucus, and the LGBTQ Faculty Staff Caucus. And these caucuses exist on campus to hold the university accountable and to create ways that we can be more inclusive as a university. So it's a collection of individuals that get together and talk about things that aren't going well, things that are going great, and what the university could do. And this is a good resource for the university. Develop leadership and professional development programs for a diverse workforce. That should go without saying. Second to last, know the difference between acceptance and support. When you say you accept something, how is that different than when you actively engage in support ways and the methods of support? Very different things here. So know how your language is. If you tell someone you accept versus asking someone how you can support them is a very different conversation. And then the last one, be active in the community. It goes a long way with community members. And looping back into the very beginning with Gen Z employees want to work for companies that are active in the community, that are doing social activism work, and that are engaging in all of these different areas of allyship. And a quick review before we wrap up and turn it over for questions. We have about 10 minutes left. Inclusive language, I don't know how to stress this enough, but language matters. The words that come out of your mouth, the things that are on job descriptions, things that are on the evaluation, your annual evaluations, those matter. So using pronouns correctly, avoiding unnecessary gendered language, talking about identities and race and ethnicity in proactive and modern ways instead of looking at things that are done in the past. And again, these go from job descriptions, policies to marketing. Language truly matters. Second, find and end systems of oppression. I guarantee you they're within your organization, because I guarantee that anything that is a system or has a process is susceptible to bias and discrimination. So if you have a process as part of your corporation, whether it's the onboarding process, whether it's the hiring process or evaluation process or promotion process, if it's a process, it is susceptible to discrimination and bias. And it really takes intentional work to get that done. And the last part here, reiterating that point, build support structures. Systemic problems need systemic solutions. It has to be intentional, or they won't fix themselves. So that's all I got for you. And I think I saw some chat stuff coming up, and I want to turn things over to, or get Michelle back in here so we can answer any questions y'all might have.
What I wanted to do was to give people the opportunity to share some of the best practices or that they have at their organizations. This was a great opportunity last year for people to share what they're doing. So can the host please give the attendees the opportunity to unmute themselves if they'd like to, so that we can hear more about what you all are doing in your organizations to make them more inclusive. So does anyone want to share?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle and Wes. This is Courtney with the Career Center. First of all, I just want to thank you both so much. This is wonderful information, and I can share a very small example of some of the things we've been talking about while everybody else might be thinking of theirs. Friends in the group here, you should have the ability to unmute yourself and show your mic and show your camera. If you don't, please feel free to chat and I can give you that, but you should have the control to do that. So the language matters piece is really important, because within our office, we work with a lot of external vendors to either drive our event registrations or help students find jobs and things like that. And some of the things that we're looking at is, if we don't build these systems, then we might not have control over how questions are asked. And so we're trying to take an internal look at how some questions are phrased, and if it's a multiple choice answer for a student to fill out profile information, and maybe they don't fit in that multiple choice box, right? And so I think that's really important to bring to our employers as well, because I know there's a lot of application tools out there that students are going to be using to apply with these employers. And I would definitely second you in saying that take a look at that and fill it out as a prospective student, and make sure you open your mind to see what a student is seeing, or what a job seeker or what an applicant is seeing when they are whenever they are trying to apply for a position. I also wanted to ask as well, if nobody else chimes forward, and if they do, that's great, how employers can best work with your office to recruit and maybe connect with some of these folks that your office is seeing that they'd like to engage with.
I think the first way is obviously through diversity at work. I will say that if there's an opportunity that is specifically where you specifically want to target some diverse students, definitely we feel comfortable having, sharing the information. In the past, if we weren't dealing with COVID, if someone wanted to set up shop at the African American Cultural Center or something like that, and some organizations have done that, that would work. This happens to not be a great time for that because we won't be allowing that type of activity, but we're happy to share job notices. I know that we get them and we share them via our listservs. We have had employers to contact us directly and say they wanted an intern and that they wanted resumes, and we've contacted students on the spot, usually, and get resumes back in a couple of days. But what I will say is students are looking for engagement. So again, when there are opportunities to be on campus, not just career fairs, particularly for those of you who are alumni, when you're an engaged alumni or an engaged organization, students really appreciate that, building. They look on LinkedIn afterwards and they might contact you, but I think that's a great way for you all to get in touch.
That is awesome. Thank you, Michelle. I know that we definitely get contacted by a lot of employers looking to be able to have a more presence on campus, around campus, in different groups and different environments. And so I'll be happy to connect them with you in the future when we are back to a normal-ish state of reality. I noticed that Wes just included the document in the chat that provided a good checklist for some inclusive terminology. So for those of you here now, if you go into the chat, you're able to download that PDF. I think that's really helpful. And I would like to go ahead and open it for any best practices or other questions. Again, feel free to unmute your mic and show your video. I'll give you a second.
For example, does anyone's organization already have affinity groups set up that you'd like to share? Can y'all just go ahead, Leah?
Hi, yes, Leah Carter from Halliburton. To answer your question, and I thought I showed my video. I think my laptop is closed at the moment. My apologies.
Yeah, you're a little hard to hear.
Oh, let me see. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And let me get my video back going. Okay. Hi. So speaking to the affinity groups, that is something that we do have. We've got four or five different affinity groups. We have one that's targeted more towards the young professionals networking. So those who are newer and earlier in their career and looking to get connected and get some advice from those in leadership roles. We have our Pride group, which is our LGBTQ+ organization, which is our newest one. That was a huge step for the organization to have an organization like that established. So we were really excited. We have a women's organization. We have a veterans group, and then we also have an African American networking group that is in the process of being rebranded so that it can be taken global. So that's something, and we've utilized those groups to help in our recruitment efforts on campus, and it's been shown that they are phenomenal. We've even had interns who ended up accepting an offer when they found out that we had certain affinity groups and there were certain benefits that were incorporated into our company benefits that showed that inclusiveness that they're looking for. So it's definitely been a big help for us.
Yeah, if I can ask, how do y'all go about creating these groups? And if somebody has an interest in a new group that has not yet been created, what is that process or protocol for getting that established?
So for all of the groups, there definitely needs to be a how can it support the business? How does it help grow the business? And so it's getting a group of folks together who are in support of this group. Then it's identifying an executive sponsor. Each one of these groups has someone in an executive leadership role who is essentially the sponsor and saying, hey, I support this organization being there. And so they'll identify an executive sponsor and then put together a charter, a mission. What is the goal of the group? What are you looking to do? How are you looking to impact the company from the bottom line or from an employee standpoint? So there's quite a few different levels that employees would need to go through in order to get the organizations approved. The two newest ones would be the Pride and our women's organization. Our women's organization was established back in 2014, and then our Pride was established in 2017. And the others have been around for a little bit longer, but there definitely needs to be a business need and show how it impacts the business, how it can positively impact employees as well. So there's a number of steps, and then ultimately it's presented to our chief of HR, VP of HR, and other business professionals to say, here's the impact and here's why we need this organization.
Thank you for sharing. That is awesome, actually. And Michelle, I just noticed put in the chat, Michelle, this is something we would love to help you partner with or promote to our students. I know you're promoting it as well, but we can help because it looks like you're putting together a panel for diversity at work. That is amazing. And I'm sure we will have some employers that want to participate in that. That is cool.
We already partnered with y'all.
Okay, so I'm in the dark. I'm too busy planning events. There we go. That is incredible. Well, I personally work with employers who I know would love to serve. So now that I'm personally aware, I got your back.
Okay.
I got your back. Does anybody else want to share any strategies or have any questions before we break? Well, this was great. Gosh, I thank you both so very much. Thank you, Leah, for chiming in. I know y'all were a part last year of our event, and we are so grateful to both of you for participating again this year. You had some wonderful information, and we are so glad that we are partnering on the panel together. And thank you for joining in our event. To our employers, we do have a little mini break for lunch. And so we will connect at 30 minutes, I believe, at 12:45 with our next set of sessions. And so thank you for joining this session. Michelle, Wes, we appreciate you. Thank you so very much.
We appreciate you. Thank you.
Y'all have a great day.